There is a version of Spanish history that never happened, but that came remarkably close to being possible, and understanding how close it came tells us more about the modern Spanish monarchy than almost any event that actually occurred. Imagine a timeline in which King Felipe VI chose to abdicate not in some distant, unspecified future, but in the autumn of 2023, the same season his daughter Leonor turned 18 years old and swore her constitutional oath before the Spanish parliament. In that version of events, the crown would not have passed to a seasoned military officer with years of naval voyages, fighter jet flights, and parachute training behind her. It would have passed to a teenager fresh out of a boarding school in Wales, thrust immediately into the most symbolically weighted position in the country, with none of the preparation that the real Leonor has spent the last 3 years building. Would Spain's future have changed? And if so, how much, and in what direction? To understand why this question matters, you have to understand what actually stands between a Spanish heir and the throne, because it is not as simple as turning 18 and receiving a crown. Under the Spanish Constitution, succession happens the moment a reign ends, whether through death or abdication, not through some birthday. Article 57 establishes the line of succession, and Article 59 addresses what happens if the monarch is a minor at the moment succession opens. In that scenario, the Constitution does not allow an underage monarch to reign directly. Instead, a regency is established, typically held by a parent or the nearest adult relative in the line of succession, and that regent governs in the monarch's name until the young monarch reaches 18. So the real question buried inside our hypothetical is not simply what would happen if Leonor became queen at 18. It is what would happen if the reign had already begun before she turned 18, placing her under a regency for some period, and then transferring full authority to her the moment she came of age, with no military academy, no naval voyage, no fighter jet cockpit, and no university lecture hall behind her. This is not just theoretical. Spain has lived through exactly this kind of abrupt, accelerated succession before, and the precedent is not comforting. In 1886, King Alfonso XIII was born a king, literally born after his father's death, meaning Spain had an infant monarch from his very first breath. A regency, held by his mother, Queen Maria Cristina, governed the country for 16 years. When Alfonso turned 16 in 1902, he was granted full royal powers years earlier than a normal Article 59 regency would allow today, and what followed was a reign that historians generally regard as turbulent, marked by political instability, colonial catastrophe in Morocco, and eventually the collapse of the monarchy itself in 1931 when Alfonso went into exile. That is an extreme example, from a very different constitutional era, but it illustrates something structurally true that persists into the present day. A monarch who ascends without the accumulated credibility of years of visible, deliberate preparation inherits a symbolic deficit that takes years to repay, if it can be repaid at all. Now compare that to what the current Princess of Asturias has actually been doing since she turned 18. Rather than ascending to the throne, Leonor entered the General Military Academy in Zaragoza in August 2023, roughly matching the timing of our hypothetical abdication scenario. She spent a year training with the army, swore an oath of allegiance to the flag, and was awarded the Grand Cross of Military Merit by her own father in a ceremony that was equal parts family milestone and constitutional theater. From there she moved to the Naval Military Academy in Marin, and in January of 2025 she boarded the historic training ship Juan Sebastián de Elcano for a 5-month transatlantic voyage, sharing a cramped cabin with fellow midshipmen, standing 2 in the morning watches, and visiting ports across Latin America and the east coast of the United States, effectively serving as a floating ambassador for the Spanish crown before she had spent a single day exercising royal authority. Her third and final year took her to the General Air and Space Academy in San Javier, where in December of 2025 she completed her first solo flight in a Pilatus PC-21 trainer, becoming the first woman in her family's history to pilot a military aircraft alone. In the spring of 2026 she went further still, becoming the first member of the Spanish royal family in history, ahead of both her father and her grandfather, to complete parachute training, earning the right to wear the parachutist badge known in Spanish as the Roquisqui. This is the version of preparation that our hypothetical 18-year-old queen would never have received. And the significance of that gap is not sentimental, it is structural. The Spanish monarchy, since its restoration under Juan Carlos I in 1975, has survived almost entirely on accumulated legitimacy rather than absolute constitutional power. The King or Queen of Spain does not govern. They do not vote on legislation, appoint ministers by personal will, or direct foreign policy. Their entire function is symbolic and unifying, a role that depends almost completely on public perception of competence, neutrality, and seriousness. Juan Carlos built that legitimacy through his handling of the attempted coup in 1981, when his personal intervention, broadcast to the nation in military uniform, is widely credited with holding the fragile post-Franco democracy together. Felipe VI built his legitimacy more slowly, through decades of visible institutional groundwork before his own accession in 2014. Leonor, whether by her family's design or the country's expectation, is doing the same thing in compressed form, using her 3 years in uniform as a visible, undeniable credential that no critic can dismiss as unearned privilege. Strip that away, and put an 18-year-old on the throne instead, and you create a monarch who must build that same legitimacy after ascension rather than before it, in full public view, with every misstep magnified by the fact that the country is simultaneously deciding whether to trust her at all. This is precisely the dynamic that made Alfonso XIII's early reign so fragile, and it is a dynamic that other European monarchies have wrestled with as well. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands ascended at the age of 10 in 1890, under a regency held by her mother, and did not take the throne in her own right until Ta turned 18 in 1898. Her early reign was marked by exactly the kind of tentative public trust that a young, unproven monarch tends to receive, trust that had to be earned gradually over decades rather than inherited on day one. There is also a more immediate, more practical dimension to this hypothetical that is easy to overlook. A monarch, even a symbolic one, is expected to represent the state at official functions, receive foreign dignitaries, deliver the annual Christmas address to the nation, and serve as a steadying public presence during moments of crisis. Spain in the 21st century has faced no shortage of such moments, from economic downturns to regional independence movements in Catalonia to public health emergencies. An 18-year-old thrust into that role without the intervening years of controlled, gradually escalating public exposure would face an extraordinarily steep learning curve, and would be doing so while every word and gesture was scrutinized by a press and public that had not yet decided whether to extend her the benefit of the doubt. The real Leonor has been permitted to make her early public mistakes, if she has made any, largely out of the spotlight, within the relatively forgiving context of being an heir rather than a reigning monarch. A reigning 18-year-old queen does not get that luxury. Every appearance becomes a referendum on the institution itself. This is where the regency provisions of Article 59 become genuinely important to the hypothetical, because they suggest that the Spanish constitutional system already anticipated this exact danger and built a shock absorber into the process. If Felipe had abdicated while Leonor was still a minor, the government would not have handed her the crown outright. It would have installed a regent, most likely Queen Letizia as her mother, to govern symbolically in Leonor's name until her 18th birthday. That regency period would have functioned as a kind of compressed apprenticeship, far shorter and far more public than the current arrangement, but still providing some buffer between the moment of succession and the moment of full authority. Even so, the difference between a regency ending at 18 and 3 additional years of deliberately chosen military, naval, and now academic preparation is enormous. The regency model protects the country from being governed by a legal minor. It does nothing to guarantee that the newly empowered 18-year-old actually possesses the accumulated public credibility that Leonor is now building through choices that go well beyond what the Constitution strictly requires. And this raises the sharper, more uncomfortable question buried inside the original premise. Would Spain have survived an 18-year-old Queen Leonor without lasting institutional damage? Probably. Constitutional monarchies are more resilient than they often appear, and the Spanish system in particular has weathered abdication, corruption scandals surrounding Juan Carlos, and periods of open republican sentiment in certain regions without collapsing. But surviving is a low bar. The more interesting question is whether an 18-year-old queen would have strengthened or weakened the monarchy's long-term position relative to a growing undercurrent of republican sentiment among younger, more secular, more skeptical Spanish voters, particularly in regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country where the institution's legitimacy is already contested. A monarch who arrives with 3 years of hard-earned, gender barrier-breaking military achievement arrives with a built-in answer to the oldest criticism of hereditary monarchy, the charge that the position is purely accidental, unearned, granted by birth rather than merit. An 18-year-old queen arrives with no such answer prepared, and would have had to construct one entirely in retrospect, under conditions of much greater public pressure and much less margin for error. There is one more layer worth considering, and it concerns the sister rather than the heir herself. In our hypothetical timeline, if Leonor had ascended at 18, her younger sister Infanta Sofia would have become heir presumptive at an even younger age than she currently holds that position, intensifying the pressure on the entire family structure years earlier than has actually occurred. The real-world sequencing, in which Felipe continues to reign while both daughters are permitted to mature, study, and in Leonor's case complete military service, before either of them faces the full weight of succession, appears almost deliberately engineered to avoid exactly the kind of compressed, high-pressure transition that our hypothetical describes. Whether that is genuine long-term strategic planning by the Spanish royal household or simply the ordinary, unremarkable passage of time is impossible to know from the outside. But the contrast between the two timelines is instructive regardless of intent. So would Spain's future have changed if Leonor had become queen at 18? The honest answer is that it likely would have survived, because constitutional monarchies are built to survive exactly this kind of shock, with regency provisions specifically designed to prevent a governance vacuum. But survival and strength are not the same thing. The Spain that exists today is one where the heir to the throne has spent 3 years earning credentials that no one can dismiss as merely ceremonial, flying solo in a military trainer, standing overnight watches on a transatlantic naval voyage, and becoming the first person in her family's history to complete a military parachute jump, all before she has exercised a single day of royal authority. The hypothetical 18-year-old queen would have inherited the crown. The real Leonor is building the case for why she deserves it. In an institution that survives entirely on public trust rather than legal compulsion, that difference may turn out to be the single most important variable in whether the Spanish monarchy still exists in its current form a generation from now.